Upchurch, back to tell you more about Upchurch history. And I have a special message for you today concerning the methodology I used starting some 40 years ago. And the problem I had was it was immediately visualized that the American Upchurch family was a pretty large family, and it went way back in history, way before the Revolution. In fact, as we've reported, our ancestor, the progenitor of all American Upchurches, came to Surry County, Virginia in 1638. And so you can imagine now we are 14, 15, 16 generations beyond Michael Upchurch I. So I had the challenge 40 years ago in starting serious research on the Upchurch family in America to figure out what kind of system to use. And I have perfected a system I would like to tell you about. And let's start out by taking a look at the first 5 generations of the Upchurch family in America. And I have a chart here which shows the 5 generations, starting with Michael Upchurch I, going to his son Richard I, then to his 2 grandchildren, then to his great-grandchildren, and then to his great-great-grandchildren here. And this then shows you the principal characters. Now, I have left out all of those who did not have any children because they wouldn't have any ancestor today for me to be talking to. What we know is that Michael Upchurch had only one son, Richard Upchurch I, that gave issue. And he had the 2 sons. Now, for convenience sake, I have started numbering these as Michael Upchurch I, Richard Upchurch I, John Upchurch I, James Upchurch I. And the reason for this, as time went by, we found we had dozens of individuals named James Upchurch, and Richard Upchurch, and John Upchurch, and William Upchurch. And given these early generations and the need to distinguish one from the other, I started using this convention of Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3. It does not necessarily mean that William Upchurch II was the son of William Upchurch I. It only means that he was the second Upchurch I found by that name. So someplace up here would be a William Upchurch I, but since he didn't have any children, it doesn't show on this chart. So my first convention I'm telling you about is the use of this Roman numeral 1 to characterize Upchurches who had very common names. I also adopted a convention of classifying the different generations. And for example, with the 3rd generation, since we now have 2 individuals, I call these heads of tribes. So the James Upchurch group I call the JA tribe. The John Upchurch group I call the JA tribe. And then we move from tribes to the 3rd level, to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th generation. And in the 4th generation, we call these individuals who had descendants heads of branches. So here we have the Southampton branch, the Oxford branch, the Moccasin Creek branch, and the Brunswick branch. Perhaps sometime later I'll go into more detail and explain why I picked these particular names, but in general it related to the fact that there was some physical location associated with where these people lived. So as we move from the 4th generation to the 5th generation, we have what I now call the heads of clans. So in the Oxford Upchurch branch, there were 2 known individuals who had descendants, and they were John Upchurch IV and William Upchurch III, and they headed clans. I have numbers for those clans, but I've not clouded up this chart with those numbers. We simply go by the name of the individual, saying that John Upchurch IV was head of the John Upchurch IV clan. And likewise, in this branch, we had 5 clan heads: Edith, Harmon, James IV, John III, and Selah Upchurch, and so on. This adds up now, of all of these individuals in the 5th generation, to be 22 individuals who had offspring and presumably could be a progenitor of Upchurches living today or of Upchurch descendants in the case of the females where they lost their name Upchurch as they married a male with a different name. Now, another characteristic in this system I have developed, which, by the way, I call the Michael Upchurch system, and I'm sure you can imagine why I selected that name, But this additional convention was that as I identified each individual, as I went through the years, I gave them a number, one by one by one. And the first individual had the name, had the number 1, and I used the convention XID to identify these numbers. The X is just a number, a letter to have in front, and ID is identity. So XID 1 is a certain individual. I believe that's Moses Upchurch, who's down here. And then, then other individuals I named, I would give a number. So many people who have followed the work that I've done over the last 40 years have come to understand these conventions of using Roman numerals, of using the names of the various divisions, such as the tribes, the branches, and the clans, and they've become accustomed to seeing the number XID. Just for your information, at this point in time, I have now identified and given assigned XID numbers to over 60,000 members of the Upchurch family, and these are all published in the Upchurch Bulletin. The clan heads you see here are very important for communication purposes, and I hope that each of you who are listening to this presentation and who are interested in your ancestral line will come to know to which clan you belong. Let me give you a little perspective as to how this works out in terms of time. Michael Upchurch came in 1638 to America. He was born in 1624 in England. Now, these children in the 5th generation lived about the time of the Revolution. In fact, 3 of the individuals listed here were in the Revolutionary War. So that shows you these lived at about the time of the Revolution. That took about 150 years. We generally say that a generation takes about 30 years. So if we go through 5 generations, 5 times 3 is 30. So we've covered 30. 5 times 30 is 150. So we've covered 150 years, covering 5 generations with 30 years per generation, which is a fairly decent average. Now, if you go beyond this to reach to someone that you actually might have in your mind, if you go another 5 generations to about the time of the Civil War, you have the 9th generation. So many of you will be able to reach back through your family history to identify someone who served in the Civil War, who would be a descendant of one of these clan heads. These conventions are very useful in communicating as we write to one another and as we talk to one another, and allows us to narrow down what part of the family we're talking about. I hope you will keep in mind these conventions and this arrangement of the first 5 generations in the family and put it to good use as we all communicate more about our wonderful Upchurch family.
Thank you.